Well, we have a situation now where dozens of Melbourne supermarkets could close this weekend, unable to find enough staff to open their doors. And the reason is this: Coles says it has 3,000 staff in isolation across Victoria and New South Wales. Coles says it's already running reduced hours at 15 supermarkets, and as we know, the situation in Melbourne is only worsening. Aldi has closed several stores in Victoria and New South Wales. It's also cut trading hours. Seems like at least 100 staff were forced to isolate. Woolies says it's got about 1,000 staff in isolation. Some stores, again, running at reduced hours, and others also could be forced to close their doors this weekend. Now, this issue of staff shortages associated with isolation requirements is not something new. We were chatting about this earlier in the month, in fact, with the Woolies CEO, Brad Banducci. Have a listen.
It takes the country to put food on the shelf, really. Delta means that you end up with a lot more of your team isolating, and much more quickly, and how we adjust our processes and protocols around it is a big area of conversation between us and industry and government. So it's a relatively challenging 4 to 6 weeks ahead of us, in particular in our warehouses. And the problem in a warehouse is you can't just bring an untrained worker into a warehouse. And these teams have important skills, and if you bring an untrained worker, you put them at risk. So how we get them back into our warehouses is a big challenge for us.
So entire workforces being just wiped out by isolation requirements. That was the conversation I was having with Brad Banducci, the Woolworths CEO, about a month ago. And he was telling us that now something was basically what is happening, playing out before our eyes and looking like coming to a head this weekend, particularly in Melbourne. Supermarkets are highly complex, interconnected logistical webs. Brad Banducci said it takes a country to put food on the shelf. Now, they simply cannot function when they have entire teams, let alone thousands of staff, holed up at home, even if they've been sitting there being delivered multiple negative tests and double vaccinated. This developing story reveals a big spoke in the wheels of our great economic reopening that we are so optimistic about. With vaccination rates high and still climbing, the definition of close and casual contacts and how we isolate people is just not suitable anymore, and it is not workable. In a high vaccinated Australia, more people will get COVID. So how can businesses live with COVID if the workforce gets plunged into isolation by close, casual, or even fleeting contacts? Now, interestingly, there's been a leaked New South Wales health document doing the rounds this evening, and it is hinting that the issue is being heard and there's a major overhaul that could be on the cards in that state. Now, what's hinted at in that document is that fully vaccinated people who visit pubs, offices, restaurants or shops will no longer be identified as close contacts and forced to isolate, even if they are exposed to COVID-19. Exposure among the fully vaxxed in most settings is going to be deemed low risk. Now, as I said, this is just leaks, nothing is official, and this has just come out of New South Wales, leaks out of New South Wales. It's subject to change, and New South Wales is the state has been the most vocal about learning to live with COVID. I'm not sure this is going to fly in Queensland, WA, Tasmania. These states won't even open their borders at 80%. Can you see them putting aside the current isolation rules? It's a prickly one. And at the moment, as I said, it's leaving us without food on some shelves and without workers in our supermarkets, let alone the other businesses, big, large and small, across so many industries facing this issue. Innes Willox is the CEO of Australian Industry Group. He joins me on the line. Innes Willox, welcome to the show.
Hi, Brooke. Hope you're well.
I'm well, thank you. I think this is a critical issue that businesses know that we are very much in the dark about, and I find this quite staggering as we talk about reopening.
Well, I think this day of reckoning was always going to come. Businesses have been saying this to state governments for some time, that their system of insisting that anyone within a store or within proximity of a case or a close contact or what is declared a Tier 1 site, that they have to go into isolation for 14 days was never practical, but it's increasingly impractical in a world where we are going to get more cases as we emerge into this new phase of living with COVID. And, we see this in businesses large and small across all sectors, having to shut down entire operations or go on to skeleton staff, because they've had a case come into their workplace, irregardless of what COVID protocols they have in place, how they've kept staff separate, how they've kept staff and customers safe, is just not workable. And we're starting to see that play out now. And for governments to say they weren't aware of this or hadn't heard of this is just flies in the face of reality. They've known about this for a very long time. But it all at state government level, particularly in Victoria, which is playing out now, everything gets run through the Chief Health Officer, and in the end he's the decider, but it comes at enormous cost to business and people's livelihoods.
So the Chief Health Officer always gets a good hearing. I mean, is the business perspective being heard and understood?
Well, I think when you have big outlets like Woolies and Coles and Aldi, starting to say, look, we're going to have to shut shops and stores, distribution centres are groaning. When you've got big food processing companies saying the same thing, when you've got distribution centres having to close, it's really the rubber hitting the road, and it will hit home to governments and their health officers that their decisions they make, which are a million miles away from reality in many cases, do have practical and real impacts. So they are listening. I think the fact that these closures are now occurring and are likely to occur in coming days has made it real. They might have previously thought that it was a bit of a put on, but it never has been. Business, large and small, have struggled to keep going as they've had closures and staff reductions forced upon them. And at some point it reaches breaking point, and that point is now.
Well, it sounds like it's about time they do listen. What is the practical alternative that business is proposing?
Well, what business is saying is that from virtually day one of COVID, going back 18 months or so, they have been requested and demanded of them that they put in place COVID-safe plans. That's plans to keep staff separated, to work in bubbles, to not have crossover at all where possible. All of those sort of measures, the basic measures around social distancing, hygiene and the like, and business have implemented those to the best of their ability in accordance with guidelines. And that's the way that we should operate. Government needs to recognise that businesses have set themselves up in a responsible way to be COVID safe. They do operate under very clear restrictions and guidelines. They work to government requests and requirements, and that should be taken seriously and should be acknowledged in decisions that governments make about closures. So we've had so many cases, Brooke, of members of ours who've had to shut entire plants, entire factories, or been threatened with that on the basis of one case, even though that one case has been kept well away from, 75, 80% of the workforce. So they need to put into practice what they've asked business to put into practice, and that is recognise that the great majority of businesses have very good and have had very well-functioning COVID-safe plans for a very long time.
Innes Willicks, do you think the Victorian government is going to renege on reopening after the explosion in cases we saw today?
You'd certainly hope not, but you fear so. From the language of the Premier today, that they might have to hit the pause button on the reopening at the same time while committing to the reopening sends a very mixed signal to business and to the community, who's already very tired of what's gone on down here. You can see the fatigue everywhere you go, but it would send a terrible signal to walk away from the national reopening plan that has been agreed. You'd hope that they will stick to the course. We all knew it was going to be tough, and we're in the hard part now.
Thank you so much. Innes Willicks, AIG CEO, thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
131873, do you agree we need to relook all of these close and casual contact isolation requirements? Has it affected your business, or have you in fact been affected? Let me know what you think of all of that. We also had the Treasurer today confirming support for businesses in New South Wales. The ACT and Victoria will be tapered at 70% jab targets, then pulled away completely at 80%. And the Treasurer is saying that if he turns off the money taps at those thresholds, it might just force some premiers to open up more quickly. Wonder if you think that will work. Or as a business, do you feel like that just inflicts unnecessary stress and suffering on you and your workers? Are you ready to stand on your own 2 feet at the 80% vaccination rate? 131873. I wonder if you also back the Treasurer's optimism today as he talked about a huge burst in economic activity when economies reopen.